Welcome back. On this episode, I'm chatting with Jay Bandy, the founder of Goliath Consulting Group. Jay brings in tons of experience working at iconic brands like McDonald's, Blimpies, and is helping founders, executives of restaurant brands take their business to the next level. In this episode, I get a chance to pick Jay's brain on what it really takes to set your business up for success. What are some pitfalls that restaurateurs face along the way? And where is he placing his bets for the future of the restaurant industry from a technology, operations, and hospitality standpoint? Hope you enjoy. Jay, welcome to the show. Happy Friday. Thanks so much for joining us today. Very excited to talk to you.
Happy Friday. I appreciate you inviting me, Daniel, and look forward to the conversation.
Amazing. There's so many ways that I can take this conversation, but before we kind of dive deeper into your background and all the cool roles that you've played and what you're currently doing with Goliath, I am very curious, how did you end up where you are today? What were some of the early experiences you had at different brands, and what made you decide to go into the restaurant industry?
Absolutely. It's interesting getting out of college. The economy was not pretty back in 1986. And, it was hard to make money. I lived in Louisville, Kentucky, graduated school there, had to leave. It's just, I couldn't, I would have actually taken a step back from my part-time jobs, getting a full-time job. And literally, like some college graduates with a political science degree, just go out and look and see what's available out there. So of all the things that, all the people I talked to, met Randy Puritan with Blimpie Subs and Salads. And, Randy had some good things going on. Sound like there was some growth. And I naturally, from being 10 years old, I had an affinity for food. So I had no problem getting in the kitchen and creating things as well as following recipes, et cetera. So yeah, it was just a great opportunity, I thought at that time, just to make some money, honest to God. And it turned into a career.
Amazing. At the time you joined Blimpie, how many stores were they at? What was the timeline there when you joined?
So they had roughly 100 restaurants. And
Okay.
that actually was their figure. So I called one time to the office in New York. I was in Atlanta. And they go, how many restaurants do we have? They said roughly 100. They didn't know how many restaurants they had.
Wow. And that's I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, if they were growing too quickly or if they just were disorganized. But I mean, Blimpie was before my time, but it was a fascinating growth story, and the fact that they scaled to over 2,000, 1,000?
2,000 restaurants in 8 years.
2,000 restaurants. How long were you there for, and what were some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, so I was there until 2000. Meaning 2,000 restaurants. And I kind of saw some writing on the wall that made me say that maybe I should do something else now. What's interesting, and, that'd be in my next book, right, is how you take a concept and scale and grow, and how's that work, right? So it was pretty cool at 23 years old at that point. I'd been in Blimpie for a year to see how you do that, right? How do you organize a team? How do you set goals? How do you execute goals? How do you mobilize people? And so that's what it was with Blimpie, was all those things put together in a solid business plan to grow the company. And so it was exciting. I got to do everything, I was in charge of supply chain as one of my jobs, but also opened hundreds of restaurants. It was a great place for me to cut my teeth in the business.
I love that. And, I just had a conversation with a friend who she's working in high finance. So she's doing a lot of stock picking and working on Wall Street. And she's always wanted to work in the restaurant industry. And we just spoke earlier. She's asking me, how the heck do I get into the restaurant industry? And, I try to answer it in different ways. I think there's different archetypes of leaders, and some people start in the kitchen. And some people move their way into the restaurant industry in non-traditional ways. And
correct.
If you were to give guidance to someone on a path that you find to be successful in the restaurant industry, what would you recommend as someone that is just wanting to get some experience and want to work in the restaurant industry? Where would you guide them to start looking? Not to make the decision for them, but where would you guide them to maybe ask the right questions or talk to different people? Like, what would be that path?
I think one of the important things, if you want to make restaurants a career, is you need to look at multi-unit chains. It can be independent groups, but you need to start with folks that have more than one restaurant because there you're going to get the education, you get the opportunity to learn more about the business. A lot of people get pigeonholed into one restaurant, one owner, and it's hard to grow. But if you're in a multi-unit environment, it gives the opportunity to learn. They have a training program and move forward. So that's always my recommendation to folks. If they want to get into the business, start somewhere where they have more than one restaurant.
I see. And I think a lot of people in my generation have an affinity for chefs and have an affinity for, yes, celebrity chefs for that matter. And they get drawn towards the mission of the brand. It gets drawn towards the restaurant concept. And I think that could be a double-edged sword, right? You could be working alongside some brilliant restaurateurs, but perhaps you're missing what you just mentioned is the breadth of experience allowing you, like yourself early on, to touch a little bit of the supply chain, touch a little bit of the marketing, touch a little bit of the operations. And I think that is what's ultimately very important. So after Blimpie, what did you get up to next? What was the next arc in your career?
Yeah, so I had a couple kind of shorter stints. I spent a couple years with Baldino Subs and Salads out of North Carolina, but they had an office in Atlanta. So worked with them. Very successful, actually, much more successful in terms of unit volume than Blimpie. So that was actually fun for a couple years. Wasn't a place where I saw growth. From there, I went to RTM. RTM no longer exists. The 750 Arby's restaurants they sold back to Triarch, which, now has turned into another company. They also owned a few other brands. So I worked with the Mrs. Winters brand and Least Famous Recipe, which is actually out there still kicking and doing a good job.
Yeah, in Ohio.
Yeah, so I got an opportunity. That was a really strong group of restaurant leaders. You look at GPS Hospitality of Atlanta, there's a chunk of them there. Some of them went to Focus Brands, some of them are Aspire Brands, and they're all running departments or running companies of the folks, that I worked with there. So that was great to see, honest to God, just what excellence looks like, because that was one of the sharpest group of people I had worked with.
Let's focus in on that. Were they operators? Were they the owners of the franchise locations, or were they the operations team behind the scenes?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both, right? It was a $1 billion company. And so there was everyone. They had their own treasury department, et cetera. So it was a legit big company. But, it all started with some friends and partners in the beginning. There were 4 of them that bought their first couple Arby's restaurants and turned that into a $1 billion company. And so, it was a combination of some entrepreneurialism, but also they only just hired the top 20%. And it was sometimes brutal because there was a bunch of alphas in the room, men and women, but everyone was just focused on all the things that are important about the business, not focused on anything that wasn't. And it was all results driven. And I love that environment. Very competitive. It's almost like being in a sporting event, right? In terms of keeping score, looking towards the goal line. How are you going to get there? What do you have to do? And so I've always enjoyed that environment. I thrived in that just because I enjoyed it. It was fun.
I actually really like that analogy. I've never thought about it like that. I think I speak to a lot of franchisors on this show, right? And I've spoken to a couple of franchisees that are getting up there in unit count, 80, 100. And you brought something up that kind of clicked. It's almost like playing a sports game. And the rules are in a game, or they're defined, and it's all about how do you make that score? How do you beat your competitor?
Right.
And maybe the analogy here that I'm trying to make is that, and push back if you disagree with this, but as a franchisee, you're given the playbook, you're given the rules, and then it's all about how do you optimize. And so you have to have a strong team around you that has optimized and executed in the past. While on the franchisor side, if you're starting your own brand or if you're growing a concept, there's a lot more, let's just say, freedom that you get. And perhaps the growth and maybe the way that you approach scaling is a little bit different. Or maybe even the types of people that you bring on are a little bit different.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, because being a franchisee is about blocking and tackling, right? It's about execution on a daily basis. maximizing every opportunity because you can't really work too much outside the playbook. If you do, the franchisor is going to slap you down. You
Right.
bring some ideas to the table, but you have to execute what's given to you. And that's, if you have a proven franchise model and there's other successful people out there that you can model, then you just go after that.
hmm hmm Who are the types of people that you like to work with at Goliath? And tell us a little bit more about your firm and what you do.
Yeah, so Goliath Consulting, we work with everyone. So it's a different environment than the corporate world I came from, right? So, I do get to pick and choose who I work with and make sure our values match and their drive to build the business matches ours. And the great thing is if people are going to hire us, they have a desire to get better. That's like a foundational thing. Otherwise, why would they hire us? So we generally get environments where we can help people grow either unit count, sales, et cetera. And so we do a lot of consulting, and with independent restaurant groups, but also we work with some bigger chains on more specific parts of the business. So Pat Conlon that runs Wayback Burgers, I knew him from the Blimpie days. And so we helped Pat with menu development for about 5 years, very specific part of the business. But yeah, it's fun touching all the different parts of the business. We help people build restaurants from the ground up. We help build the brand. We help develop the menu. We go through the construction and design phase and then help them open. And a lot of times we also get engaged longer term to help them then grow multiple units. So that's a big part of what we do. But also personally, I've done contract work since we started. So been a DOO, COO, president of companies. And so I get direct operations experience as well. So right now I'm COO of Big Table Restaurants in Atlanta, Georgia. I also run a restaurant group in Greenville, South Carolina. So those are two contract fractional gigs that allows me actually to take what we talk about on the
And
consulting
apply it.
and apply it on the direct op side. And it's fun because, I'm actually sitting in Greenville, South Carolina. Now we have 3 restaurants open. We've got 3 more under development. I came from a restaurant this evening that since the day we opened about 90 days ago, you can't get in unless you go a couple weeks out to get a reservation. So it's fun
Nice.
seeing, the
Yeah.
whole circle come together and, seeing success. So it's exciting.
How do you handle context switching from one group that you're working with multiple brands here, and then clients that you're working with doing this? Like, how do you handle that context switching and all the different people that you have to work with and different strategies that you have to run with?
That's just how I started. So I'm a bit of a different bird, right? In terms of, I started with 30 franchisees at 22 years old. So I had to learn 30 different personalities, what their strengths and weaknesses were of them and their businesses. And so I've almost always done this, except for my corporate stints. I spent even my 8.5 years at McDonald's, I worked with a bunch of franchisees, 100 plus franchisees. So I've always been around the environment where you have to adapt, right? You have to adapt your leadership. You have to adapt, how you approach the business depending on the situation. Yeah, it was learned early on in my career.
Let's imagine I come to you and I'm a budding entrepreneur. I come up with what I think is an amazing concept, a wedge in the market. I'm taking one cuisine, I'm combining it with another cuisine, and I'm hopping on a trend. I come to you and I say, Jay, I have this idea. I don't know where to start. We talked last time about creating the business plan in a way.
Right.
How would you coach someone like me to get started? And also, where would you kind of push back a little bit to make sure that kind of ruffle my feathers a little bit to make sure that I'm really in it to win it?
Yeah. So it's really about validation, right? So I don't, and there's nothing new in the business, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you
right.
really got to be special
You got to,
to come up with
yes, yes,
something new, right?
right.
And so I'll be able to find a parallel or someone that actually is already doing what you thought was unique. But even if it is something that maybe is partially unique, right? Because that's the best you could do, is I'll run through the scenarios, right? Because I have general knowledge about a whole bunch of different parts of the business. And so we'll run through scenarios of like, if you do this, this is expectations. If you do this, you'll see different results. And so run through some of those in the first meeting to go, here's, and also give you an idea of what success looks like. A lot of people that come to me don't realize, and I've had, folks that go, I don't want to work 60 hours a week for a year. I don't want to spend 250, 500, 5 million, whatever the dollar figure is for what their vision actually cost. And so generally those meetings, Daniel, 2/3 of them are, thank you, Jay, for saving me,
Right.
the heartache of going through this. And a third of them, they go, okay, I got it. Okay, I feel good about this. Let's move forward. So I'm more of a major league hitter batting average on that than anything beyond 315.
For
There's a
sure.
lot of things, and it's time well spent because a lot of people don't know what they don't know about the business, and it's eye
Absolutely.
opening.
Absolutely. What are the types of mistakes that entrepreneurs and early restaurateurs make when they go about bringing their concept to market that you've noticed?
Yeah, it's a multiple of things, but there's some big ones, right? So the first thing is coming in undercapitalized. You hear that over and over again, but it's true, right? You got to realize that you need 50, 100, 200 grand in the bank when you open, depending on the scope of your operation. So they way underestimate the amount of cash they need in the bank to open. They underestimate what it costs to open a restaurant. Opening restaurants right now increases 8 to 10% year over year. So if you were looking at a restaurant 10 years ago, it's going to cost you twice as much today to open that restaurant. So they way underestimate. The next thing is they don't hire professionals. So they didn't hire a lawyer to read their lease. They didn't hire a lawyer to read their franchise agreement. They didn't get a CPA to set up their books. And you keep going down that path, right? And then a lot of times the concept they have is not vetted, right? They didn't think about competitive analysis and come into the market of understanding who the competitors were and how they were going to stand out. And the last thing that we talked about just a minute or two ago is you need a plan. People, it's interesting in the business, like a business plan is a 4-letter word. It's not. If you don't have a plan, you're not going to be successful. That's all there is to it, right? I mean, yeah, there's one out of 100. Oh, I put it on the back of a napkin. Yeah. The other
Right.
92 people, they lost all their money.
Right. Right. We've seen success stories. I think most recently with Dave's Hot Chicken getting sold for $1 billion to Roar Capital, and we know the story there is they started out of their what seems like in a small little pop up and tested their concept in the market before they went and got their own store. Is there any way for a restaurateur or just an aspiring entrepreneur to de-risk the concept? Try it out first. How do they get that validation early on before
Yeah.
they go all in?
The beauty of today's world, right? There's so many incubators out there, and incubators to me also are small food halls, right? So you can get into business for $100,000 or less. The whole thing with food halls over the last 10 years has allowed people to get in, to model their concept, to test it out, see what folks think. And, I've worked with a number of operators that have gone through that process, some successfully, some not successfully. But instead of maybe losing $1 million, they lost maybe $100,000, right?
Right,
And,
right.
go to market, that's a lot less exposure on a personal basis. Generally, this is all people's personal wealth that they're spending.
Right. That's a very good point. And that reminds me of the cloud kitchens and the local kitchens of the world, right? Where they give brands a small, kind of like a micro hall or a micro kitchen where they can test out new markets. And they go in a suburb of Atlanta and they test it out there. Also, maybe try out different menu items, different locations, different ways of presenting the food. And before they go and invest in opening up a store, that is one way that they can de-risk the business. So that's a interesting, I think, case study that we've seen as a direct result of the pandemic. I think it's perhaps a good option for some brands.
It definitely is. And, still the trailer and food truck, is kind of the next level. But again, not a big investment because if you buy a food truck, selling a food truck's not a big deal, right? So
Right, right.
with brick and mortar, food truck always has value. So I also work with some folks that go that route, right? And work either festivals or, these days there's a lot of breweries out there that don't have food. So you dock at the brewery, sell your food.
Right.
So that's another avenue I've worked with and had success with brands, just trying to figure out if it makes sense or not.
Yeah, absolutely. What's exciting you these days in the restaurant industry? New concepts or new ways of reaching customers? What's been keeping you excited to continue exploring and helping aspiring concepts grow?
Well, it's a couple of things. One is it's great to finally see that the paper, pencil, and notebooks have gone away now to a tech stack.
Right.
And the restaurant industry was a little late to the game, but it's amazing how adding tech into the restaurant world can give you a competitive edge, but also it gives you some security if used properly, right? Better point of sale,
Absolutely.
better websites, analytical tools, scheduling. There's a ton of great things out there. And, one of the things I do is I try to stay as much as possible on top of that. And I do work with some tech companies just to keep my ear to the ground on what's going on. And, the other thing that is interesting is old school still works, right? So you take tech in one hand, you
Absolutely.
take old school execution. Execution is no different than it was when I started in the business in 1986. And, some people try to take shortcuts, and there are no shortcuts. You've got to have great service. You got to train your people. You got to hire the right people. And so there's fundamentals that just don't change. And it's great marrying the two, right? It's taking tried and true principles of the business, matching those up with good tech. And that's the formula for success in today's market.
I agree. Do you have an example of when maybe technology might interfere with the execution of a restaurant or maybe even the hospitality aspect of a restaurant?
Yeah, I'm still not buying into kiosks, right? That's a easy one, right? A kiosk you might as well be on your phone at home ordering food because you're not going to get guided through the menu, even if you're in a counter service place, right? You go up and you look at the menu. Hopefully the person that's taking your order has been trained. Like, have you been here before? May I recommend some things, right? And so you totally miss that. And so the kiosk to me, it has a purpose, but I think people overuse it. And, that to me kills service and hospitality in a restaurant.
It's the very, I wouldn't call it controversial take. I think it's very, people are still, the jury's not out yet in terms of kiosks. Some people really like it. I was just having a meeting with my team and we were talking about how we can improve our product to make it more hospitable. And we got into a debate around ordering food when you walk up into a restaurant. And this is more fast casual QSR type style.
Mm-hmm.
The pressure that some people feel when there's a line behind them and they still haven't made up their mind on what they want to order versus the trade-off of going to a kiosk and having the freedom to roam around and decide on what they want in their own time. Some people really like it, some people don't. But I still keep coming back to this point where we should never lose the hospitality element of going to a restaurant, whether it's QSR, whether it's fine dining. That element still needs to exist because why would people come back, right? I mean, the food can be good for one part, but it's all about the experience, in my personal view. Maybe my generation will decide differently, and we'll all be ordering food off our phones and not care about where the food comes from. But I hope that's not the future.
Well, I think it also depends on the consumer, right? Because I'm a
Of
I'm
course.
a consumer as well, right? So I eat out all the time.
Right.
It's the nature
Right.
of what I do, right? So if I go to a McDonald's, today's world, right? I prefer to go to the kiosk. I know exactly what I want. I don't have to interact. I get my food. Yeah, I'm good to go, right? I would actually
Right.
prefer a kiosk in that environment. But if I'm going to, like today, went to lunch, want to sit at the bar, grab a margarita, have a couple tacos, talk to a colleague of mine, just kind of download about the business. I want that environment. So I think there are multiple environments that people seek out depending on what that dining event is. I don't, kiosks are always going to have a place, as well as going to a bar and talking to a bartender. So I think both can coexist.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. So you've you mentioned earlier in the episode that you're thinking about maybe writing a second book. What was your first book on, and where can the audience find it?
Yeah, so the first book is about just, I would say, foundational restaurant leadership. So if you just bought a restaurant and want to figure out what you're supposed to do, it covers the soft skills that you need, right? Or if you were a restaurant manager or a middle manager and you're kind of stuck in your career and you can't find out what you're missing, that's what that book's about. It's how you communicate with people. It's the soft skills. It's, yes, you do need to go to your chamber of commerce if you own a restaurant in a market, right? All those kind of fundamental things that a lot of times you're not gonna get unless you've got a really strong training program. And so the book's on 115 pages and covers everything you need to know on that segment, right? Of just getting into the business and understanding the broad stroke of fundamentals you need. My next book's going to be about, okay, you got 5 restaurants. Now what do you do? And so the skill set to go from 5 to 100 to 100 to 2000 is very different, right? And so that's what the next book's going to be about, is really strategic leadership, really understanding brand and truly just the strategy of the restaurant business. And
I love
so
that.
I look forward to that because that's what I do day in and day out. That's what I do. I still mentor folks in the block and tackle stuff, but a lot of the work I do now is strategy. And I just look forward to putting that into a book. And again, like any book, all the answers will be there, but how do you take the book and actually execute? People are still going to call me like, how did you do that? So no matter, even though the answers are there, applying
Right.
the knowledge is the key.
Right. You're not going to be out of a job anytime soon. That's for sure with
No.
this book. People still need the hand holding, the mentorship, and the accountability, which I think it seems like you're doing a great job with. Last question, Jay, before we wrap it up. I always like to ask my guests, who in the restaurant industry inspires you? Who's someone that either mentored you along the way or you look up to, someone that my audience would gain some value if they follow along their journey?
What was interesting, there are a few people, right? So at Blimpie, Tony Conto, Tony was the one he and his brother Joe were kind of the brains behind moving the business forward. And there are other people on the team, but those two I spent a lot of quality time with. What was interesting, so I'm in Manhattan again, 23 maybe. He goes, let's grab dinner. So we go to Union Square Cafe. Danny Myers sits down at the table, right? One restaurant, they were buddies, both Manhattan guys. And it was just interesting then seeing Danny's path and all the things that he's done over the years, right? And created an amazing restaurant empire. And really the last person that influenced me on more of the execution side of the business, Russ Umfenauer, that was one of the partners in RTM and then was at Focus Brands. Just his approach to the business. I learned a lot with him. I got to spend some time with him during my career at RTM and just learned a ton from him on just the operations execution side of the business. So really that would be, in terms of some mentors, that would be a handful of them there.
Thank you for sharing. Jay, this has been a pleasure. I thank you for everything you do for our industry and for my audience that's listening in. Jay's links for Goliath, for his LinkedIn, where to find him is all going to be down below. Thank you so much, Jay.
Awesome. Daniel, thank you for your time.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.